what accounts for this interest? The interest of Hefe, the interest of queer theorists and critics and activists in the counternormative, in the discontinuous, in spaces of freedom, in experiments, in sensuous, sexual experiences and experiments. Why this resistance to guilt and shame, resistance to normativity? To answer this, we sort of have to go back to that initial tone that I set at the beginning of the first video, right? The tone set by the passage from Sedgwick. It's important, despite the sort of more affirmative sense that Hefe gives to queer in her 2010 article, it's important not to forget a long history that for many people isn't a history, but is in fact their life, right? A history of vulnerability, a history of shaming, a history of abandonment, a history of obscurity, of isolation, of violence, of exile, of illness and death, a history that for many is related to this issue of same-sex desire, though it is not limited to it. Same-sex desire, an issue that queer studies often problematizes, often attempts to expand to other sorts of desires that aren't so easily called same-sex, aren't so easily called gay and lesbian. An issue for which gay and lesbian activism is still seeking recognition, despite the work of queer studies to try to expand it out to issues, for instance, of temporality, of kissing, regardless of who's doing the kissing. But also an issue which is still manipulated to generate widespread hatred and panic for queer lives and energies throughout the world. If we keep in mind this history, and also this present condition of living for many, we might begin to understand what queer activists, theorists, and critics seek to undermine, and why they have organized for themselves, often in provisional ways, a paradigm that attempts to disclose counternormative energies, ruptures, spaces that are capable of resisting shaming and guilt, or again of reconceptualizing them. Why they draw our attention to experiments in sensuality, sensuousness, or sexuality, and also attempt to shine light on or show ways in which certain spaces are organized to counteract the freedom with which individuals or groups or collectives may want to seek those experiments. What is it that queer activists and theorists and critics and lives aim to undermine? In a 1998 article, actually I think it was published before that, but it appears in a book that was published in 1998, an article called Sex in Public. Michael Warner and Warner and Berlant, I'm not sure if they invent the term, but I think they give the first really robust account of it as a concept. Develop a concept called heteronormativity, right? Heteronormativity. So I'm going to read, this is the second quote on a handout I gave in class. The first quote was the Eve Sedgwick quote I began with in the last video. So it's worth trying to chip our way through this rather dense passage. Quote, by heteronormativity, we mean the institutions, structures of understanding, and practical orientations that make heterosexuality seem not only coherent, but also privileged. Its coherence is always provisional, and its privilege can take several, sometimes contradictory forms, unmarked as the basic idiom of the personal and the social, or marked as a natural state, or projected as an ideal or moral accomplishment. So for instance, unmarked as the basic idiom of the personal and the social, it's a sort of default setting for many people, not for everybody, but the sort of default setting that according to which culture recognizes individuals, right? It's the default setting from which, right, homosexuality or other sexualities would be considered either divergent, deviant, or different, right? Or it could be marked as a natural state. We see this in the kind of moral panic that kicks up concerning things like gay marriage, right? What is one of the most common arguments against it? Not just that it's a sin against God's law, but that it's a sin against natural law. Next time you listen to debates, try to notice how often nature gets brought up or projected as an ideal or moral accomplishment. We can think of this in terms of most Disney movies, although Disney has occasionally been attempting to produce films that are not driven by sort of heterosexual developmental narratives, right? That end in a happily ever after. In those cases, it would be the ideal or moral accomplishment of the narrative of the film and of the characters. But anyway, that's heterosexuality. Remember that Warner and Berlant are talking about heteronormativity, which is the much larger structure under which those competing ideas of what heterosexuality is comes to seem coherent to us in culture, and also privileged in culture too. Okay, so it's not heterosexuality that they're focusing on, but heteronormativity, which is itself the sort of lens through which heterosexuality appears to us this way. It, that is heteronormativity, consists less, they go on to say, consists less of norms that could be summarized, norms or beliefs, we might say, though those aren't the same, norms or beliefs that could be summarized as a body of doctrine, than of a sense of rightness produced in contradictory manifestations, often unconscious, immanent to practice or to institutions. Contexts that have little visible relation to sex practice, such as life narrative and generational identity, can be heteronormative in this sense, while in other contexts, forms of sex between men and women might not be heteronormative. For instance, a woman who may have a male partner, right, or many male partners, but is not at all interested in having children, right? That would be, in that sense, counter to the logic of heteronormativity, or to the narratives, or to, as they call it, the structures of understanding of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is thus a concept distinct from heterosexuality. It's not the same thing as it. In other words, queer theorists, critics, and activists don't oppose heterosexuality, right? Because heterosexuality is not really a thing, right? It's a thing that appears to us as somehow coherent through a larger structure that they are calling heteronormativity. One of the most conspicuous differences between heteronormativity and heterosexuality is that the first one has no parallel. The way heterosexuality organizes homosexuality as its opposite. Because homosexuality can never have the invisible, tacit, society-founding rightness that heterosexuality has, it would not be possible to speak of homonormativity in the same sense. Although there are queer theorists, Yasgir Puar among them, that challenges that last idea. So what on earth am I talking about? What on earth is this passage talking about? What is heteronormativity, right? If it's the thing that many queer activists, theorists, and critics claim that they're in some sense opposing or attempting to subvert or undermine, what is it? Right? Going back to that first sentence again. We mean the institutions, structures of understanding, and practical orientations that make heterosexuality appear to us as coherent and privileged. The default setting, right, of sexualities or of normal, healthy lives. What do they mean by institutions? Well, we might think of examples like hospitals, right, or any kind of form you have to fill out, right, in which you're either single or married, right, where you have to identify yourself as one or the other, right. We could think of them in terms of institutions, like hospitals, again, I already said that, in which only family members might be able to visit a sick patient, Although it seems ludicrous to us now, for a long time it was the case that gay partners often had trouble getting in to see a partner who was ill, dying, or recovering from surgery because they couldn't claim themselves to be family members, right? So that's the sort of institutional logic, the way in which an institution organizes itself, right? Although we could look at any sorts of institutions, right, in like the church or the state or anything, anything like that, politics, political life, even, right, political life in which gayness is a scandal, right, that needs to be sort of hushed up and quieted, right. So that's institutions, right, structures of understanding, right. We could go back to the Hafey article, for instance, and think about time. Right, that what Hafey is really drawing out is that the way in which we think about time as linear, as progressing, as developmental, as moving forward, or the way in which we think of how a life unfolds, right? Warner and Berlant even talk about that. Things that don't even seem to have anything to do with sexuality are nevertheless sort of grouped into and part of this larger structure they're calling heteronormativity, right? And part of the structure that makes heterosexuality appear to us again is coherent and privileged. Okay. What they are really attempting to draw out then is that what queer activists, theorists, and critics oppose is not simply like the opposite of homosexuality, right? That's stupid. But rather what they oppose, much like feminism opposes patriarchy, they don't so much oppose like specific men, although they might oppose certain figureheads of patriarchy. Likewise, queer activism, queer theorists, queer critics oppose not heterosexualities or heterosexuals, whatever that would mean, but heteronormativity. So that analogy might help a little bit in clarifying what that is, for at least for Warner and Berlant. So heteronormativity then is vast, right? It's an incredibly vast system, right? It's not really run by anybody. It's just the kind of way in which many societies around the world have organized themselves, and the sort of effects of the institutions that we've organized. Again, the structures of understanding by which we understand and look at the world and understand how things should go and how they should be, and even the practical orientations, right, for how we live our life, right? Lee Edelman, who appears on the final quote on this handout, calls the sheer vastness of heteronormativity. He doesn't call it so much heteronormativity, at least as far as I know, but rather borrowing from Jacques Lacan, who we didn't really talk about much early in the semester, what he calls the symbolic order. Right. Again, for Lacan, if you'll recall from the book chapter, Lacan has these different orders, right, or these stages of psychological development that aren't just individual, but are societal, right? And when we're born, right, and the first sort of stage or order we enter into as infants is the imaginary, right? The imaginary, which is sort of in flux, right, which is somewhat creative, somewhat always kind of provisional, kind of like what Freud called the pre-edible stage, a sort of I don't think he called it this, but a sort of manifold of perversities, right? Perversities that have yet to be consolidated into a kind of one way in which that individual will develop. For Lacan, there's this transition between that state of the imaginary and the symbolic, right? And the symbolic is when we enter into and are brought into culture and into alignment with certain norms. And part of our job then, as part of that culture, is to make sure that that culture survives, upholding the norms, maintaining the norms, making sure everything runs smoothly, even though, as we know, of course, cultures do not run very smoothly. Anyway, what Lee Edelman calls then the symbolic order is the collection of codes, conventions, and signifiers that structure our experience of the world and our expectation for how the world should work. While many seek to participate in seek recognition from and subvert this order in order to change it and to transform it, right? To affirm spaces, practices, pleasures, and forms that do not line up with heteronormativity. Edelman isn't so much different from that as he is much more direct and radical in his response to the order itself that the queer attempts to subvert and to transform. Okay. So the next passage I'm going to read is pretty dense with theoretical language. One word that may really throw us off is jouissance. It's a Lacanian term that I'm not really going to define because I don't think it's necessarily important for us to understand this passage. I've explained the symbolic order, and for the sake of, again, swiftness, it might be best just to understand the symbolic order as society or culture or heteronormativity as I just discussed it. Okay. So this is Edelman. And I'll end by reading this passage, and in the next video, I'll again pick up with Edelman and try to make sense of what he's up to, and then move back into Sedgwick, who eventually will bring us back to Mrs. Dalloway in the very final lecture of this series. Okay, so here's Edelman. This is from his book, No Future: Queer Theory and the Death Drive. Note the title of the book, No Future. A much different stance on futurity than that which we get in Hayfie, and I'll be talking about that in the next video. Bernard Law, the former Cardinal of Boston, mistaking or maybe understanding too well the degree of authority bestowed on him by the signifier of his patronymic, I think that's how you say that. See, this happens all the time where you read words and you're not really sure how to pronounce them, but anyway. Bernard Law denounced in 1996 proposed legislation giving healthcare benefits to same-sex partners of municipal employees. He did so by proclaiming, in a noteworthy instance of piety in the sky, that bestowing such access to healthcare would profoundly diminish the marital bond. Society, he opined, quote, has a special interest in the protection, care, and upbringing of children. Because marriage remains the principal and the best framework for the nurture, education, and socialization of children, the state has a special interest in marriage, end quote. With this fatal embrace of a futurism, so blindly committed to the figure of the child as figure, right, as a sort of, not a literary figure, but we might call it a sign or a symbol, right, of futurity, of what the future is, right? When we look at children, that's what we see. We see the future, right? With this fatal embrace of a futurism so blindly committed to the figure of the child that it will justify refusing healthcare benefits to the adults that some children become, Law, capital L, Law, Bernard Law, lent his voice to the mortifying mantra of a communal jouissance that depends on the fetishization of the child at the expense of whatever such fetishization must inescapably queer. Some 7 years later, after Law had resigned for his failure to protect Catholic children from sexual assault by pedophile priests, Pope John Paul II returned to this theme, condemning state-recognized same-sex unions as parodic versions of authentic families, quote, based on individual egoism, end quote, rather than genuine love. Justifying that condemnation, he observed, quote, such a caricature has no future and cannot give future to any society, end quote. In other words, Pope John Paul II was referring to gay families or queer couples as a caricature of true marriage, true coupledom, and true futurity. Edelman goes on to say, or to write, queers must respond to the violent force of such constant provocations, not only by insisting on our equal rights to the social order's prerogatives, not only by allowing our capacity to promote that order's coherence and integrity, but also by saying explicitly what Law and the Pope and the whole of the symbolic order for which they stand here anyway, in each and every expression or manifestation of queer sexuality. Fuck the social order, and the child in whose name we're collectively terrorized. Fuck Annie. Fuck the waif from Les Mis. Fuck the poor innocent kid on the net. Fuck laws, both with capital L's, as in Bernard Law, and with small. Fuck the whole network of symbolic relations and the future that serves as its prop. Okay, so we'll come back to that. And actually to another passage too, in the next video, and slowly work our way back toward the questions of what any of this might have to do with how we read Mrs. Dalloway.